Beyond Time's Gaze, Episode 29. At the end of the previous episode, Xu saw a gigantic giant fang shark speeding through the water, its body hundreds of meters long and radiating the powerful aura of Foundation establishment. Chasing after it in the sky was a young cultivator standing on a huge ancient bronze sword. The young man wore a crimson Taoist robe from the first peak, his long hair flying in the wind, his expression cold and stern, and his eyes filled with sharp intent. When the young man noticed Xu, he glanced at him with an indifferent look and spoke a strange line, saying that calling the wind and summoning rain was nothing special, and that one could even put the stars into a bag to play hide-and-seek. Hearing these cryptic words, Xu frowned, sensing that the man's attitude and tone were unusual and likely carried a hidden meaning. In 7 blood eyes, each peak used Taoist robes of a different color. The second peak was orange, the 6th peak was blue, and of course violet was for the 7th peak. As for the first peak, they had robes as red as blood. When it came to 7 blood eyes, the most famous peaks in South Phoenix and the Forbidden Sea were the first peak and the 7th peak. The first peak warrior cultivators were known for being grim slaughterers. They rarely went out to sea and preferred to do their training in Forbidden by the Phoenix. Only first peak cultivators who had complete confidence in their own cultivation base and battle prowess would go out to the unfamiliar Forbidden Sea for training. Because of that, whether it was in the sect or out at sea, this was the first time Xu had ever seen one of the first peak warrior cultivators. It was impossible to misidentify another disciple. That was because their Taoist robes contained invisible designs that were connected to the identity medallion and aura of the disciple. When they got close to another Taoist robe with such designs, they would shimmer in response. The reason for this was that the sect was too big for all disciples to recognize each other, and thus there was a need for a method to prevent outsiders from impersonating disciples. However, it didn't matter that this was a fellow disciple. Xu didn't let his guard down in the slightest. What was more, he had no idea what this disciple meant with his cryptic poetry. His guess was that, perhaps, this disciple was warning him not to steal his prey. After all, he did mention a bag and hide-and-seek while simultaneously chasing a giant fang shark. Xu watched him coldly, his iron skewer glittering at his side, his shadow beneath him looking like nothing special. But ready to leap out under Xu control, his Dharma skiff was ready as well, and his snake-neck dragon was in his Dharma aperture, the row of spikes running down its long neck bristling. As the giant fang shark fled in Xu direction, he could sense its extraordinary aura. Roaring, it spun in place and then lunged toward the incoming first peak disciple. Its mouth opened wide. Suddenly, a blood mist erupted from the shark's mouth, which transformed into a host of fish and shrimp that shot toward the first peak disciple. The puny heavenly maiden's silver river, it's waiting for me to drink in one gulp. His right hand flashed in an incantation gesture, and his bronze sword thrummed, causing row upon row of sword projections to appear. In the blink of an eye, over 50 smaller versions of his bronze sword could be seen, radiating an aura of slaughter. The first peak disciple waved his finger, and all the swords except for the one he stood on shot toward the giant fang shark. Shocking rumbling echoed out, and waves surged out across the water as the giant fang shark howled. 7 or 8 of the swords stabbed into its massive frame, causing blood to splash into the water around it as it fled off into the distance. That blood contained a Foundation establishment aura, so it would scare away many sea beasts. On the other hand, it was also possible it could attract even stronger sea beasts into the area. Xu simply looked on, hovering in midair. The first peak disciple snorted coldly. The snow-white rabbit slips through the sky. The night-black toad swims on by. As the words left his mouth, his huge sword thrummed again, growing larger and larger until it was roughly 300 meters long. Then he shot over the water in pursuit of the shark. Xu hadn't spoken a word the entire time, nor had he done a single thing. He had listened to the disciple's ridiculous poetry, then watched him race off, staying on guard the entire time. Now that he was gone, Xu simply piloted his Dharma skiff off in a different direction. Based on what he had sensed, the first peak disciple was stronger than he was, but not by much. He wasn't at the level of being able to enter the profound radiant state, and probably had something around 20 Dharma apertures opened, if it came to an all-out battle to the death. Xu had the feeling he could come out on top, but a Foundation establishment sea beast wouldn't be worth getting in a fight like that. A few days later, Xuqing reached his next target destination. He was about halfway between South Phoenix and the West Coral Archipelago, roughly where he had encountered the creeping vines. There was also an island nearby. It wasn't very large, but the island itself was shaped like the character, with a natural bay. There were a lot of uninhabited islands on the Forbidden Sea. Some of them were always there. Others came and went. The former were real islands, while the latter were often some type of huge sea beast. As for this particular island, Xuqing checked the water underneath to confirm that it was a real island. His sea chart also indicated it was, but it was always good to double-check things like that. The island itself was barren and had no resources, which was why it was uninhabited. After scouring the surface of the island to make sure it was safe, he moored his Dharma skiff in the bay and took out a small bottle. Within that bottle was a blue liquid, which was ghost-longing horseshoe crab blood. By refining that blood according to the principles of yin-yang polarity, and by combining it with other medicinal plants, it was possible to create a substance that would attract ferocious beasts. It was similar to the substance the young merman had used on Xuqing. This was the method Xuqing was going to attempt in the hopes of opening his Dharma apertures. He would attract a large number of sea beasts, then kill them and take their souls. However, it was going to be difficult to control, and it was entirely likely he could attract a beast he couldn't deal with. In the hopes of fine-tuning the process, he would use chrysanthemum mollusks, which could function as a harmonizing agent. With their aura as an added layer, Xuqing's idea would still be risky, but he was willing to try it. Once I start it, it's not going to stop. As he sat on the deck, he started refining the ghost-longing horseshoe crab blood. It took about an hour, and it was nightfall by the time he finished. He watched as the shell of the chrysanthemum mollusk turned blue. At this point, all that was required was a drop of his blood to start the process. Seeing that it was already dark, he decided there was no rush, and closed his eyes to meditate. The night passed without incident. The next morning, at dawn, he opened his eyes and scattered poison around the area. Because he was in a harbor, the poison powder mixed with the seawater and began to spread about. Being very determined about how the event should play out, he put even more poison into the water. However, that wasn't enough. He needed something else to enhance the poison effect. Therefore, he took out a stick of incense and put it off to the side. It was a kind of incense designed to stimulate the poison. Once it entered the water, and he added more poison, it would become hyper-poisonous. Everything's ready to go. Eyes flickering with anticipation, he bit the tip of his finger and spilled a drop of blood onto the blue chrysanthemum mollusk. The moment it fell onto the shell, the mollusk turned a darker shade of blue. At the same time, a very faint smell pulsed off of the shell, so faint, in fact, that it was easy to miss. As the smell wafted out, Xuqing looked at the entrance of the bay. His eyes narrowed, the poison-stimulating incense gripped in his hand. Time passed. An hour later, his eyes flickered with cold light as he saw a huge plume of water in the distance. A 300-meter-long whale breached the surface, let loose a piercing cry, then splashed back down into the water. That, in turn, revealed that within the water around it was a school of fish that resembled crocodiles. They were black-scaled crocfish, which were similar to black-scaled wolves. They usually congregated in schools of over 100 individuals, and usually reached the 8th or 9th level of chi condensation. As for the whale, it was in the great circle of chi condensation. Seeing this, Xuqing's eyes lit up. As he waited, the black-scaled crocfish caused waves to surge as they rushed toward the bay. The whale was close behind. Shortly thereafter, rumbling sounds filled the bay as the black-scaled crocfish entered, swimming straight toward Xuqing and slamming into his Dharma skiff defenses. Booms rang out, but his Dharma skiff defenses were strong, and they didn't even crack under the assault, just as in the Forbidden Region jungle. Sea beasts were primarily body cultivators, and few had magical techniques. For the most part, their tough physical form was their greatest asset. Only about 100. That's not much. Not hesitating at all, he put more spirit stones into the formation to power the defenses. Before long, he saw more waves off in the distance. This time, it was a school of huge swordfish, larger than any he'd seen before. There appeared to be hundreds of them. Most were between the 3rd and 5th levels of chi condensation, but there were 40 or 50 that were in the 8th or 9th level. Their eyes were bright red as they rushed into the bay. That was when Shu Qing tossed the poison-stimulating incense stick into the water. Instantly, the more than 100 types of poison in the water erupted, and the black water turned an even deeper black color, so that it looked like a thick ink. As the effect spread, the black-scaled crocfish trembled and went still. The whale was also rendered motionless. The same thing happened to the swordfish. After the time it takes an incense stick to burn, the entire bay, which had just been spraying with water, was completely still and silent, eyes filling with anticipation. Shu Qing waved his hand and made a grasping motion. As a result, a huge hand formed from water grabbed all the sea beasts and dragged them toward him. Then, Shu Qing's Dharma apertures erupted with flames that shot out to burn them. Of course, they weren't dead. His poison was powerful, but he hadn't designed it to kill them, just render them incapable of fighting him. As the black flames burned, one soul after another flew into Shu Qing. There, in his Dantian region, they became soul shadows that served as kindling as he battered at his third Dharma aperture. Only a moment later, a tremor passed through him, and his eyes glittered as his third Dharma aperture completely opened. When that happened, spirit power rushed into it, and then Dharma force spread out into his body. He didn't stop there. With the black flames still absorbing souls, he was able to send the power toward his fourth Dharma aperture. It opened. The bay had become a place of death. Though there was nothing on the surface, below the surface were numerous beast corpses. With 4 Dharma apertures opened within him, Dharma force surged through him, and his aura became stronger than before. As the black flames raged, and the fire within his 4 Dharma apertures burned, it made Shu Qing seem like he was engulfed in flames as he sat on the deck. Though this was a far cry from the profound radiant state, it was clear that his Dharma force was far more majestic than when he had first stepped into Foundation establishment. This is the kind of speed I'm looking for. Sometime later, Shu Qing opened his eyes, looked around, and then started creating more of the ghost-longing horseshoe crab substance. Time was like water, flowing by day by day. The beast corpses were like dead leaves, drifting down, in the blink of an eye. More than 20 days passed. Shu Qing was no longer in the same bay as before. He had changed islands 5 times. This was his 6th uninhabited island, and on this one, he had dug out a simple bay to use. During those 20 days, he had done only one thing other than change islands: focus on breaking open Dharma apertures. He just opened his 10th. Within the black iron skewer, Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior had spent the last half-month in a state of absolute trepidation. By now, he was in somewhat of a daze, and was convinced he was in one of the ancient records he'd read in the past. With each Dharma aperture that a cultivator opened, more soul power was needed, and the process became more difficult. Because of that, it had taken the Patriarch 8 years to open 10 Dharma apertures. But Shu Qing had done the same thing in 20 days. It was a rate of progress that left the Patriarch gobsmacked. Based on what he knew, even in 7 Blood Eyes, it was common for disciples to take 2 years or so to open that many Dharma apertures. The only exception would be in the case of a huge war, in which a cultivator could kill large numbers of enemies. But there had been no major war for 7 Blood Eyes in many years. There were only occasional small battles. As for the use of sea beasts, the Forbidden Sea was vast, but although the sea beasts weren't very intelligent, it was hard to kill them in large numbers. It was only by using poison and spell formations that Shu Qing was able to achieve such rapid progress. There weren't many people who could do that. It not only required special resources, it necessitated an exceptional level of strength to begin with. And it also required the ability to make sure truly dangerous sea beasts didn't show up. Shu Qing knew that he couldn't keep this up for a long time. First of all, ghost-longing horseshoe crabs were rare, and he had already refined the 2 he had, and only had a bit of their blood left. At the same time, he didn't have a large number of chrysanthemum mollusks. What was more, Shu Qing was starting to feel nervous. He was creating a lot of beast corpses in the bays he visited, and if he kept it up, he was worried it might attract the attention of something truly terrifying. Because of that, he was already thinking of going back to the sect. Right now, he was extracting the soul of a snake-necked dragon, which he used to batter at his 11th Dharma aperture. Even as a crack appeared on the 11th Dharma aperture, Shu Qing's pupils constricted, and he looked off at the distant sea, his eyes gleaming. That aura, off in the distance, the surface of the water exploded as a roughly 300-meter-long sea beast shot up into the air. It was covered with what appeared to be a metallic suit of armor. and it had a huge, vicious mouth. While it hung in the air over the water, it looked over at Shu-Ching in the bay. That's a Foundation Establishment armored mackerel. This wasn't the first Foundation Establishment sea beast he had encountered in the past 20 days. Just 7 days before, he'd run into a spiral-toothed horseshoe crab. Its terrifying appearance, astonishing aura, and the furnace-like heat it had in it gave Shu-Ching the impression it could enter the profound radiant state. He had immediately retreated to the land, maintaining full vigilance and keeping his Dharma skiff's godliness ready to use. However, the creature hadn't seemed very interested in him. It simply examined him for a moment, then left. Ever since then, he had been even more on guard against such dangerous beasts. As he looked at the armored mackerel, he came to the conclusion that it was very powerful. It seemed intelligent, as it didn't get too close to him, but rather circled the island as if taking stock of him. Its armor made a distinctive clinking sound as it swam through the water. Then, after enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn, it suddenly shot toward the bay Shu-Ching was in, halfway toward him. It leaped into the air and howled in his direction, releasing a shockwave that created a wave on the surface of the water that rumbled toward the island with mountain-toppling, sea-draining force. Shu-Ching's eyes glittered coldly, and his Dharma skiff thrummed as godliness converged within it. Shu-Ching reached out with a grasping motion, and his snake-neck dragon appeared in mid-air. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the snake-neck dragon flew toward the armored mackerel. In response, the armored mackerel stopped and backed up to flee. Apparently, it realized Shu-Ching was someone who shouldn't be trifled with. As it dove into the water to flee, it can't enter the profound radiant state. Shu-Ching's eyes lit up. He had been hoping to find a Foundation Establishment sea beast that couldn't enter the profound radiant state. Now that he had found one, there was no way he could let it get away. Bursting into motion, he became a streak of light that shot forward, while at the same time, he raised his hand over his head. The image of a heavenly saber appeared above him, which he slashed down toward the surface of the water. Water crashed as a 300-meter-long furrow opened up in it, revealing the armored mackerel. However, its armor was truly spectacular, as the heavenly saber didn't damage it at all. Instead, the fish turned to look at Shu-Ching with a ruthless expression. However, that was when the iron skewer flew forth, a bluish light glittering on it that revealed it was covered with poison. Shu-Ching had done that at the fervent request of Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior. It seemed like the iron skewer was intending to hit the fish's armor, but at the last minute it spun bizarrely in the air, then stabbed into the armored mackerel's eye. The armored mackerel let loose a howl, then shivered. Instantly, the area around it became filled with countless projections of fish scales. All of them thrummed with Dharma force. If they struck a chi condensation cultivator, that person would definitely die, yet they didn't stop Shu-Ching. The black flames within him spread, emerging from his right hand to form something that looked like a dagger. This was a magical technique from the Balefire soul-swallowing scripture that came after opening 10 Dharma apertures. It was called Baleblade, and it changed its appearance depending on the needs of the cultivator. Right now, the dagger of black fire pierced right into the armored mackerel, destroying its armor and sending fire out to cover it. Shu-Ching wasn't done. Next, he sent his shadow out toward the fish. Looking very alarmed, the armored mackerel twitched, causing its armor to vanish and take the flame with it, then transform into a metallic tempest that raged toward Shu-Ching. Having accomplished that, it swished its tail, which caused a huge wall of water to rise up between it and Shu-Ching. Glaring at Shu-Ching, the fish then opened its mouth and spat out a huge black pearl. The pearl was filled with rotting corpses, some of them beasts, some of them humanoid. The corpses all opened their eyes and howled as if they wanted to escape from the pearl. In fact, their arms began to emerge from within the pearl, making it look like it was covered with spikes as it flew toward Shu-Ching. His eyes were cold as the fire billowed higher around him. The spectral drought demon appeared behind him, howling, while at the same time his snake-neck dragon shot out from the water and toward the black pearl. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the snake-neck dragon swallowed the pearl. The dragon's belly suddenly swelled as if the pearl were fighting violently to escape, but the dragon kept it contained. After all, the dragon was the manifestation of a magical technique. That said, it seemed like it wouldn't last for much longer. Meanwhile, Shu-Ching burst through the metallic tempest sent at him by the armored mackerel. His personal defenses were activated as he closed in on the fish with his dagger of flame aimed at its eye. The fish howled, and seemed to want to dive back down to the bottom of the sea. But Shu Qing's shadow had split into two parts, one stretching toward the island and the other wrapping around the armored mackerel. As the fish struggled against the bonds, Shu Qing's dagger stabbed into its eye. Then he lifted his left hand, and his 10 Dharma apertures raged with fire, covering that hand, pushing down on the armored mackerel. He began to immolate it. As it burned and soul power streamed into Shu Qing, he suddenly felt a sensation of profound danger. Looking up, he saw dozens of ancient bronze swords flying through the air toward the armored mackerel. They were arrayed in such a way that the attacker obviously didn't care about hitting Shu Qing. Worse, a huge vortex appeared directly below, giving Shu Qing no other option than to back up and use his black flames to create a shield to defend himself. Rumbling sounds rang out as the dozens of swords fell, stabbing into the armored mackerel. Of course, it had lost its armor, so it was immediately sliced to bits. At the same time, Shu Qing backed away at top speed. After making sure he was clear of the falling swords, Shu Qing's face turned extremely grim as he looked at the fish corpse floating on the water. Then he looked up to see a young man flying atop a huge ancient bronze sword. His crimson Taoist robe made him very eye-catching. As the first peak disciple stood with his hands clasped behind his back on his sword, streams of energy and blood rose from the corpse of the armored mackerel, which he then absorbed. Looking down coldly at Shu Qing, he said, "It is no waste to wait from dusk till dawn. As you wish, produce a new treasure to add on." Then he turned and left. Shu Qing didn't say anything. Looking at his snake-neck dragon, he saw that the pearl inside it had stopped struggling now that the fish was dead. It was completely suppressed by his snake-neck dragon, who was now consuming it. He hadn't been able to extract all the soul power from the armored mackerel, but he had managed to take about 40% of it, so he sent it toward his 11th Dharma aperture. A moment later, the 11th aperture opened, and his Dharma force rose to new heights. Then he looked in the direction the first peak disciple had disappeared to. Knowing that the disciple didn't have a life flame, Shu Qing's killing intent began to burn. Waving his hand toward his Dharma skiff in the bay, he sent the terrifying godliness within it out in an attack. A golden beam of light shot off into the distance toward the first peak disciple. When the first peak disciple saw that, his face fell and he scrambled to pull off an incantation gesture. As he did, the huge bronze sword he stood on tilted up to block the incoming godly attack. Then the sword shattered, and blood oozed out of the corners of the first peak disciple's mouth as he was shoved backward 300 meters. There, his eyes shone with killing intent as he looked at Shu Qing. Easy it is for youths to discard an escort. The fifth watch sounds, taking the escort's life. Shu Qing had no idea what that meant, so all it did was make his killing intent stronger. Bursting into motion, he closed in on the first peak disciple, his dagger slashing toward the young man's throat. Shu Qing had his own set of principles. Previously, this person chased a giant fang shark right past him. It wasn't that he hadn't been tempted by that shark. He had been. But he hadn't made a move because he felt that the shark wasn't his. It was just like that time. So long ago, when Sergeant Thunder gave him some steamed buns to eat, he had been deeply grateful from the bottom of his heart. That said, he wouldn't have felt it inappropriate for Sergeant Thunder to not give him those buns. Later, he treated Sergeant Thunder to some snake and had felt fully justified in joining wholeheartedly. He had no problem wolfing down what belonged to him. It was the same today. He had worked hard to capture that armored mackerel, had nearly killed it, and was just about to fully extract its soul. Then this person rudely jumped in and attacked the fish. It was behavior that, to Shu Qing, crossed the line. The last person who had acted this way toward Shu Qing was that young merman. If someone far stronger than him treated him in this way, he would patiently wait for the right opportunity to destroy them. But this person wasn't that strong, and Shu Qing wasn't feeling patient. Bursting into motion, his black dagger rippled with dark flames as he aimed it toward the young man's throat. The first peak disciple's sword had collapsed, but an illusory sword appeared in front of him which blurred to intercept the dagger. A boom rang out, and Shu Qing didn't hesitate to follow up with a punch mirrored by the howling spectral drought demon. His sea and mountain incantation, coupled with his Dharma body, unleashed such force that a vortex sprang into being in the air in front of his fist, rumbling toward the first peak disciple like it could rip apart anything it touched. The first peak disciple's expression flickered as he backed up. His hands met each other to perform an incantation gesture. But then Shu Qing's shadow closed in, wrapped around his wrist, and interrupted. That distraction had profound effects. Shu Qing's fist slammed into the illusory sword in front of the disciple. His fist crushed through the sword like a boulder crushing a drinking glass, and as the sword exploded, the blow landed on the young man. The first peak disciple's pupils constricted, and blood sprayed out of his mouth as he tumbled backward like a kite with its string cut. And before he could stabilize the terrifying force threatening to rip him apart from the inside, the water below him exploded as a snake-necked dragon lunged up with its gaping maw. At the same time, a huge heavenly saber appeared, bursting with shocking momentum as it slashed toward him. In that moment of deadly crisis, the first peak disciple's eyes were bloodshot, and he howled at the top of his lungs. Instantly, something like a furnace raged into life within him, something almost like the profound radiance state. Brilliant light spread out everywhere, shredding the snake-necked dragon into pieces that dropped down to the water below. They quickly reformed, but it was obvious the dragon had sustained serious damage. Meanwhile, the heavenly saber struck true, but let loose a thrumming boom as it did. Though the saber hit the disciple, it didn't slash him in half. Instead, it caused blood to ooze out of his mouth as he borrowed the force from the blow to retreat 300 meters. Shu Qing had noticed that the young man had something that resembled the profound radiant state, yet was different. His best guess was that it was a secret magic that released a fraction of the power of the profound radiant state. However, this young man didn't have a life flame, and therefore using this secret magic would harm him. Shu Qing's assessment was correct. As the first peak disciple fell back, he coughed up a huge mouthful of blood, and the raging furnace within him winked out. His face was now very pale, yet his eyes were still locked on Shu Qing and burning with the desire to do battle. He didn't know Shu Qing, and didn't believe that Shu Qing was worth knowing. This disciple was the most recent, and also final, apprentice to be taken in by the Peak Lord of the First Peak. In other words, he was the First Peak's 9th Highness, and it had been a very long time since he encountered a fellow disciple from the sect who could make him cough up blood. Now, his eyes filled with killing intent as he glared at Shu Qing, stabilizing his energy and blood. He wiped his mouth clean of blood and waved his trembling right hand. Instantly, a host of over 30 bronze swords appeared behind him, arranged in a complex spell formation pattern. As they radiated intense sword energy, he pointed at Shu Qing, and the swords shot forward. Then the first peak disciple sprang into motion, looking almost like a sword himself as he headed right toward Shu Qing. Shu Qing looked completely calm as he also charged forward, waving his hand to cause the black fire in his 11 Dharma apertures to spring to life. The fire then erupted out of him, wreathing him completely in flame. At the same time, numerous illusory flame daggers appeared around him. When they slammed into each other, a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering boom rumbled out. Shu Qing's daggers collapsed, and the flames surrounding him faded a bit. However, the first peak disciple's swords all shattered, and he coughed up 3 successive mouthfuls of blood. Shu Qing also sustained injuries, but because of his body cultivation and Dharma body, he didn't even pay attention to them. But the first peak disciple was an extraordinary individual. More sword projections appeared around him and shot toward Shu Qing as he approached, filling the sky and causing rumbling sounds to echo out over the surface of the water. Shu Qing waved his right hand, and a huge wave rolled up, transforming into an enormous hand that grabbed toward his opponent. Meanwhile, the first peak disciple performed an incantation gesture and touched his forehead. Instantly, the mark of a sun appeared on his forehead, then sent out dazzling light that destroyed the hand of water. Shu Qing frowned, but kept pressing the attack. This time, as they closed in on each other, he decided to resort to a simple headbutt. A boom rang out, and blood oozed out of the corners of his mouth. At the same time, the first peak disciple howled in grief, tumbling back, his forehead bleeding and seemingly about to collapse. Shu Qing was about to chase after him again, but suddenly realized something and backed up. The instant he did, all of the broken pieces of the sword from earlier suddenly shot out of the water, creating a tornado of blades that swept right over the spot where he would have been passing through if he gave chase. The first peak disciple suddenly ceased howling. After backing up a few more meters, he stopped in place to catch his breath. Inside, he was shaken by Shu Qing's performance. The first peak disciple felt confident in his own status as a very strong cultivator. His own master had outright said he was. In fact, His master said he was the strongest new Foundation establishment cultivator with no profound radiant state in the entire history of the first peak. This fight was a big blow to his faith in himself. However, he wasn't ready to give in yet. When I go strolling in the sky, the sun and moon both say goodbye. The only response he got from Shuqing was a second godly attack from his Dharmaskiff. The dazzling beam of light caused everything around it to ripple and distort as it shot toward the first peak disciple. The first peak disciple's expression yet again flickered, and he immediately threw out a jade talisman in front of him. The talisman exploded, and a host of soul shadows appeared from within it. These soul shadows were all the beasts the first peak disciple had slain. By using a special sealing method, he captured them and transformed them into a magical technique he could unleash. Most were beasts from Forbidden Region jungles. As they appeared in the open, they merged together to form one huge pitch-black monster that faced the incoming attack of godliness. Everything rumbled loudly. The first peak disciple's eyes burned with killing intent as he bit the tip of his tongue and spat out a mouthful of blood. Then he lifted his right hand again and jabbed it onto his forehead. A tremor passed through him, and his energy and blood surged. His skin became crimson, to the point where he looked like he was covered in blood. And there was something sharp and incisive that glittered within him as well. Just barely, it was possible to see the image of a huge, blood-colored sword surrounding him. As he pierced through the air toward Shuqing, Shuqing felt a sensation of danger, but he didn't back down. Throwing both hands out in front of him, he tapped into all 11 of his Dharma apertures, causing each of them to emit a 1,500-meter sea of fire combined together. That was a total of 16,500 meters that raged in all directions. As that sea of fire was reflected in the water below, the forbidden sea energy for 16,500 meters in all directions combined with it, creating a crushing pressure, and the first peak disciple in his blood sword form slammed right into it. A boom rang out. Shuqing's 16,500-meter sea trembled and began to fade away. But at the same time, the first peak disciple in his sword form shook violently and began to collapse, starting from the tip of the sword. It didn't take long. After 10 breaths of time, the blood sword collapsed, and the first peak disciple was sent tumbling away. As he did, Shuqing's 16,500-meter spirit sea became a massive fist which shot toward him. Mouthful after mouthful of blood sprayed out of the first peak disciple's mouth, and his eyes went wide. In that critical and potentially deadly moment, he didn't hesitate to pull out a pearl that he then crushed. A haze of water vapor instantly surrounded him, blocking Zhu Qing's terrifying attack and simultaneously allowing the first peak disciple to turn and flee. His expression seemed very unsightly, and he had given up any aspirations of continuing the fight. For one thing, he got the feeling he couldn't beat this opponent. In addition to that, he was terrified of this 7th peak disciple's spirit sea. He couldn't assess Shuqing's cultivation base, but he had the feeling it was close to being able to produce a life flame. However, just as he thought he was about to escape, a black shadow shot out of the water and wrapped around his leg. Then, the first peak disciple's face fell as he realized an iron skewer was shooting toward his throat. He was nearly losing his mind with the intense sense of imminent crisis. Before he could do anything, a pop could be heard as the iron skewer hit him. However, it didn't pierce into the skin of his throat. What was more, it seemed the shadow had finally met its match, as the first peak disciple slipped out of its grip as if he were coated in oil. The first peak disciple didn't escape without paying a price, though, as a jade pendant he had hanging around his neck shattered. It was a life-saving item his master had given him, which would substitute itself for him in death. Now that it was destroyed, true terror appeared in the first peak disciple's eyes. Without any hesitation, he started fleeing at the highest speed he could muster. However, behind him, Shuqing waved his hand, causing his Dharma skiff to fly out of the nearby bay. As its wings unfurled, Shuqing jumped onto it, recalled his shadow and skewer, and then started chasing after the first peak disciple. This opponent was strong. In fact, he was the strongest Foundation establishment cultivator Shuqing had encountered outside of the captain in his profound radiant state. If the old patriarch Golden Vajra warrior faced an opponent like this, he would die within 3 breaths of time. But he had stolen something that belonged to Shuqing, and therefore Shuqing was dead set on killing him. The first peak disciple could move fast, but out on the water, he had only himself to rely on. That was especially true considering that Shu Qing had destroyed his huge bronze sword. Meanwhile, Shu Qing had his Dharma skiff. Not only did he not need to expend any effort to move at top speed, but also he could simply sit on the deck and recover while doing so. It was easy to imagine how a chase between the two would ultimately play out. This was one reason why the boat cultivators from the 7th peak were so mighty. Once in Foundation establishment, they were strong on shore, but at the same time could stay out on the water for long periods of time. As a result, after about 2 hours passed, the 1st peak disciple was starting to feel extremely anxious at having Shu Qing chase him with his Dharma skiff. Shu Qing wanted to kill his target, and therefore he had no qualms about using the godliness in his boat. At a certain point, he unleashed another godly attack. The 1st peak disciple let loose an agonized shriek and quickly performed an incantation gesture and threw out a talisman treasure to defend himself. Blood sprayed from his mouth, but he survived and kept fleeing, snorting coldly. Shu Qing kept up the chase. Before long, it was getting dark. As the sun set, slowly turning sea and sky the same color, Shu Qing accelerated on his Dharma skiff. This time, instead of using the godliness in an attack, he just tried to close the distance. Then he waved his hand, and the sea erupted loudly as a snake-necked dragon suddenly popped up in front of the 1st peak disciple, blocking his path. Then, as Shu Qing closed in from behind, he sent his black iron skewer shooting out. As it circled around, looking for an opening, the excited voice of Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior could be heard from inside. My lord, you have to destroy this guy. Over the years, your humble servant has read many ancient records, and I've seen a lot of accounts of people like this, based on his clothing. He's obviously from the 7 Blood Eyes 1st peak. He's in Foundation establishment, but hasn't ignited his first life flame, yet is obviously very strong. In books, people like that are usually the main character. He's obviously not an ordinary person. He might even have the title Highness. Also, my lord, did you notice that he talks very strangely? In most books, people with so many special qualities are usually very hard to kill. However, compared to you, my lord, he's like a knockoff protagonist while you're the real thing. In the ancient records your humble servant has read, people like this usually have incredible destiny. However, after you kill them, you can take their destiny. So you really don't want to miss out on this opportunity. Another thing, considering how this guy loves to indulge in histrionics and how he loves spewing loads of meaningless crap, we have a duty to beat him until he talks like a normal person. It's satisfying just thinking about it. As the Patriarch jabbered excitedly, he flew the iron skewer closer and closer to his target. At the same time, he was thinking, "You're dead. There's only one person who can survive being chased by the fiendish Shu, and that's me. There won't be a second." As the Patriarch pushed the iron skewer to higher speeds, Shu Qing got closer, lifted his hand overhead, and summoned the illusory heavenly saber, wailing inwardly. The 1st peak disciple threw out a dozen or so talisman treasures, and as they exploded, they repelled the snake-necked dragon and the heavenly saber. Then he continued to flee. However, that was when Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior saw his opening and shot forward to stab the 1st peak disciple through the arm, breathing heavily, and his eyes filled with a vicious gleam. The 1st peak disciple shouted, "Burn!" Instantly, the blood covering the iron skewer burst into flame. The Patriarch shouted in alarm and quickly worked to put out the fire, feeling like he had lost a lot of face. He howled angrily, causing a huge sealing mark to appear outside the skewer and shoot toward the 1st peak disciple. The 1st peak disciple was about to fight back, but then Shu Qing arrived. The moment he did, black fire erupted from him and surrounded the 1st peak disciple. It seemed like Shu Qing was about to start extracting his soul. This level of brutality was shocking to the 1st peak disciple, and he fell back at top speed while simultaneously trying to point out to Shu Qing that they were both from the same sect and didn't need to be fighting like this. A home amongst immortals puts the heart at ease. We two are neighbors within the mountains and seas. Shu Qing had no idea what that meant, so he tuned out the 1st peak disciple's voice and sent black flames raging out with full force. As the moment grew more critical, the 1st peak disciple shouted loudly and pulled out a small black statue of a human. When he threw it out, dazzling light exploded from it and a projected image appeared. It was a middle-aged cultivator in a black Taoist robe, his face expressionless. Looking at Shu Qing, he flicked his sleeve, and a wild wind sprang up, blocking Shu Qing's black flames. Shu Qing was also sent spinning away, blood oozing out of the corners of his mouth. When he finally stopped his backward motion, the first peak disciple was fleeing in the opposite direction. "Milord," Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior shouted urgently as he flew back in the iron skewer. "This little punk has too many tricks up his sleeve, let's just poison him." The Patriarch was really trying to make it sound like he and Shu Qing were working together as a team. "I already did," Shu Qing said coldly, looking at the first peak disciple's retreating form. All of a sudden, the first peak disciple coughed up a mouthful of black blood. Terror grew in his eyes as he sensed his energy and blood growing very unstable. At the same time, intense pain struck his internal organs, as if they were melting. Realizing that these were symptoms of poisoning, he immediately pulled out some antidote pills. However, consuming them didn't do anything. In fact, they made the symptoms worse. Shu Qing had designed his poisons specifically to counter the effects of common antidote pills. Looking more alarmed than ever, the first peak disciple unleashed a secret magic to suppress the poison. He was really confused by everything that was happening. They were both from the same sect, and all he'd done was snatch a Foundation establishment sea beast. Was that really worth this sort of life-and-death battle? Modern morals have fallen far. Bullies make me wonder who I am. Shu Qing ignored him and sent his Dharma skiff forward in a battering attack. The first peak disciple howled in grief, wondering why this seventh peak brat was so difficult to communicate with. He had already explained who he was and where he came from, yet his opponent wouldn't give up the fight. At this point, he was coming to the realization that he actually might die. As anxiety built in his heart, he bit his tongue and spat out some more blood. Yet again, he entered his blood sword form, then shot away. Time passed. Shu Qing pursued with relentless brutality. Chasing the first peak disciple for 2 days and 3 nights, they clashed numerous times, and Shu Qing always fought at full force. He took advantage of every opportunity to utilize poison, but the first peak disciple skillfully used some sort of bloodletting magic to neutralize it. What was more, he repeatedly tapped into his secret magic to assume his blood sword form and escape. Shu Qing had landed grievous blows on him numerous times, yet couldn't kill him. However, he wasn't ready to give up. Meanwhile, Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior sighed inwardly. Watching the first peak disciple flee kept making him think of himself. "You little brat. I don't care if you really are an MC. That alone isn't enough now that you've run into the fiendish Shu. The only way you could survive is if you do the same thing I did. But there are only a few open spots left for that kind of thing." At this point, only the Dharma skiff is available. Though the Patriarch sighed, he also felt quite proud of himself. By now, the first peak disciple's hair was disheveled, his robe was in tatters, and he looked very weak. The paleness of his face made it obvious how much blood he had lost. He had bitten his tongue so many times that he was worried that if he kept it up, he might not have a tongue left. By now, his cold demeanor had long since vanished. He had never met anyone as stubborn as this. During this 2-day and 3-night chase, neither of them had slept. It really seemed like this person was not going to give up until the first peak disciple was dead. The heart falls numb when winter comes and autumn goes. When leaves fall and blood pools, homesickness grows. The first peak disciple suddenly threw a medicinal pill out behind him, which exploded, revealing a host of souls. However, they didn't launch an attack. It seemed more like the first peak disciple was giving them to Shu Qing. The first peak disciple had been collecting them, some for cultivation use and some to sell to 7th Peak Foundation establishment cultivators. After all, he knew that though these types of souls weren't as useful as freshly extracted ones, they could still be helpful. Where water meets land, reach the moon in the sky, all living beings know that you rule on high. He forced the words from his mouth, hoping they would save his life, then bit his tongue and transformed into a blood sword. Meanwhile, Shu Qing couldn't make heads nor tails of his babbling poetry. However, after seeing all those souls, he sent out his black flames to absorb them. The souls didn't resist, and immediately became kindling that he sent smashing into his 12th Dharma aperture. As a result, he managed to half open it, eyes lighting up. He accelerated in his pursuit, seeing that the first peak disciple's expression became one of grief and indignation. He really didn't understand why Shu Qing was being so unreasonable. The first peak disciple had begged for forgiveness and even offered compensation. He had even pointed out that they were on the same side. But despite all that, including flattery. This was the result. It was just a sea beast, right? Sun, moon, and stars are seen every day. To we immortals, they are friends to stay. Xuqing didn't say anything in response, and instead kept up the chase. Another day and night passed. The first peak disciple had run out of souls, and Xuqing had opened 2 Dharma apertures, putting him at a total of 13. Despite that, he wasn't giving up the chase, and had even launched some mortal blows, only to have his quarry evade them. The first peak disciple was so bedraggled, his robe almost didn't look like clothing. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his face was extremely pale. On a few occasions he was hit so badly he saw stars and was worried he might pass out from exhaustion, and thanks to the poison he was even weaker, pushing him closer and closer to the point of despair. He was glad he had prepared so well for this trip out to sea. All the boosts to his battle prowess allowed him to evade numerous mortal attacks from the 7th peak disciple. Unfortunately, he had gone too far out to sea. Despite the days that the chase had stretched out, they still weren't close to the sect, and if his calculations were correct, they were still about 5 days away from it. Realizing that, his heart filled with despair. He had tried sending some voice messages to ask for help, but was so far away from shore that the messages didn't go through. As his pursuer accelerated, the first peak disciple moaned inwardly. But then he noticed rumbling sounds in the sky ahead. Craning his neck, he saw figures flying through the sky, causing thunderous rumbling sounds and kicking the seawater into a storm-like frenzy. Dozens of figures up ahead were engaged in fierce fighting, and there appeared to be 2 groups. Their cultivation bases were difficult to assess, and the shockwaves that rolled out from their blows filled the area with wild winds. The sky above them was dark, despite being a great distance away from them. The first peak disciple felt such immense pressure from their aura that he coughed up some blood. Behind him, Xuqing saw the same thing, and as his mind spun, he also coughed up blood. The figures ahead seemed almost like gods, and they definitely surpassed Third Elder. Just looking at him caused Xuqing to feel like his body might collapse. Then he saw that beneath one of the figures was a dreadnought, which was when he realized who they were. At the same time, the first peak disciple's eyes lit up as he realized that one of those figures was his master. Whooping with joy, he cried, "The setting sun casts out a divine ray of light. A new thread of hope rises up deep in the sea." When the first peak disciple called out in excitement, he projected his voice with Dharma force, ensuring that he could be heard from quite a distance. His voice pierced shrilly high into the dome of heaven. In fact, all of the dozens of fighting cultivators from both sides of the conflict heard him. Xuqing's expression flickered and he backed up. It wasn't just the unfathomable poetry that caused him to do so, but also the dozens of gazes that turned in their direction. Every single one of those gazes had eyes like gods, and all of them had auras that, despite the great distance involved, had caused Xuqing to tremble and cough up blood. Therefore, when they looked over, Xuqing backed up without any hesitation. He fully activated his Dharma skiff's defenses, took out some defensive talisman treasures, and waved his hand to call over his snake-neck dragon as well. However, the indescribable terrifying pressure was so intense that as Xuqing's mind spun, his snake-neck dragon collapsed and his talisman treasures shattered. Thankfully, his Dharma skiff was extraordinary and had been built with godliness. Therefore, though the defenses were destroyed, the boat itself remained intact. Shaking, he coughed up 2 more mouthfuls of blood. However, as the Dharma skiff's defenses reactivated and he backed up at high speed, he managed to finally stand up to the pressure. Meanwhile, the first peak disciple coughed up 8 successive mouthfuls of blood as 3 of his life-saving items collapsed and his blood sword form was destroyed. He even pulled out an amazing shield, but it shattered. By that point, he was far enough away that he could resist the pressure. Xuqing's heart pounded with fear as he continued to back up, while simultaneously taking in the scene. High in the dome of heaven, the 2 parties involved in the conflict exchanged blows that caused wild colors to flash in heaven and earth, massive rumbling to echo out, and a tempest to rage on the surface of the water. Among the figures involved in the fight, Xuqing spotted the Peak Lord of the 7th Peak. There were 6 other individuals with him, wearing different colored robes, and all of them pulsing with auras similar to his. Xuqing didn't need to guess who they were. They were obviously the peak lords of the other mountain peaks in 7 Blood Eyes. Fighting them on even terms were sea zombies. Zhu Qing had encountered sea zombies in the Merfolk Isles. As for these, his eyes stung as he looked at them, but he could tell that they looked like humans. Each one wore a black suit of armor, and their eyes burned with black flames. At the same time, they seemed to exude a towering zombie poison. There were other cultivators present as well, with weaker cultivation bases. However, they were still mighty. Zhu Qing saw Third Elder, as well as sea zombie cultivators who were roughly on the same level as him. Eventually, Zhu Qing's eyes hurt so bad that he looked away. If he kept looking, he knew that his eyes would eventually collapse. That was how much more powerful this group was than him. Suddenly, a howl echoed across the dome of heaven, and a crimson-robed old man from the Seven Blood Eyes group waved his hand. Instantly, an awe-inspiring golden sword appeared around him as he shot away from the sea zombies and toward Zhu Qing and the First Peak disciple. The old man's face was as red as his crimson robe, making it seem like he was a burning sun. At the same time, he emanated a hair-raising heat. This was the Peak Lord of the First Peak. Seeing him approach, the First Peak disciple excitedly shouted, "A new thread of hope rises up deep in the ocean. The setting sun casts out a divine ray of light. Even in a moment like this, you refuse to talk like a normal person." "My apprentice," shouted First Peak Lord, "get the hell out of here. Stick around and you'll end up dead." He waved the sword in his hand, blocking an attack from one of the sea zombies that had broken away from the main battle to chase him. In the blink of an eye, their fighting had taken them off into the distance. Hearing what the old man said, Zhu Qing's pupils constricted, and he sent his Dharma skiff underwater and shooting away at top speed. Not too far off, the First Peak disciple also seemed anxious to get away. He knew that time was limited, and if his master left him, he would be dead for sure. Looking like he was hardly able to spit the words out, he shouted, "Master, help me. This Seventh Peak punk has been trying to kill me for 10 days and 10 nights. He won't rest until I'm dead. Don't leave me. Master, hey, help!" Meanwhile, Zhu Qing didn't hesitate to push his Dharma skiff in the opposite direction with as much speed as possible. Some distance away, the old man from the First Peak looked back in shock. He had known from the beginning that his last apprentice liked to babble meaningless poetry, and that was because the young man had learned that ancient Emperor Dark Serenity had often hidden profound truths within poetry. Ever since then, he'd gone crazy trying to do the same thing. In fact, the last time the Peak Lord heard his apprentice speak like a normal person was 3 years ago. The old man's gaze shifted like lightning to Zhu Qing's fleeing form, despite how far away he was, and the fact that Zhu Qing was now underwater. The pressure of his gaze still caused Zhu Qing to tremble. And then he simply couldn't move at all, as though he were restrained in place, his life hanging on a thread. Opening his mouth, First Peak Lord said, "It's a kid's scrap," a voice said coolly from higher up. The person who spoke the words stood atop a dreadnought and was casually fighting 3 sea zombies. He was none other than Master Seventh. The First Peak disciple was visibly taken aback. However, First Peak Lord didn't react at all, and continued speaking, making it impossible to determine if Master Seventh's words had made him change his mind about what he had been about to say. "You two are really getting into a scuffle considering the circumstances." He waved his hand, and a golden paper talisman flew out. It appeared to be a talisman treasure, but at the same time seemed 100 times more powerful than any talisman treasure Zhu Qing had ever seen. It splashed into the water and headed toward him. As it closed in, it suddenly ripped in half, with one part heading toward the shocked First Peak disciple and landing on his face. The other part pierced right through Zhu Qing's Dharma skiff defenses and landed on his arm the moment it happened. Zhu Qing and the First Peak disciple trembled, and the talisman disappeared, leaving behind a golden mark on both of them. This lifelink talisman won't harm you in any way. However, if one of you dies, the other will also die. If you want to kill each other, then go ahead. But if you don't, then get the hell back to the sect. Once you're there, the Grand Formation will dispel the talisman. Next, the Peak Lord sent a massive wave of force down, picked up Zhu Qing and the First Peak disciple, and threw them off into the distance. Finally, he shot back into the battle, waving his sword to chop the leg off of one of the sea zombie cultivators. Before the sea zombie could react, sword energy shot through him, and he exploded. Then another sea zombie engaged with him, and they started fighting, rapidly moving off into the distance. Waves rolled across the surface of the sea. and a very unsightly expression appeared on Shu Qing's face as he looked down at the mark on his arm. The mark wasn't actually limited to his arm, it covered his entire body, not too far away. The first peak disciple was also looking at the mark. However, in contrast to Shu Qing, he was breathing a sigh of relief. In fact, he even took out a half-broken sword, sat on it, and looked at Shu Qing on his Dharma skiff. Shu Qing looked back at him coldly. "What's your name?" "I've lived free, as if drunk or dreaming, with a masked face. I've traveled the world, struggling to keep his killing intent under control." Shu Qing summoned an illusory dagger of black flame and rushed toward the first peak disciple. The first peak disciple heart leapt into his throat, but he trusted his master. So he forced himself to just sit in place. The knife closed in on his throat, and just when it seemed like it was about to plunge into the flesh, Shu Qing suddenly felt an intense sensation of deadly crisis. He hated to admit it, but it seemed this lifelink talisman really was astonishing. With the talisman in place, he couldn't kill his opponent, nor did it seem possible to beat him to a pulp or cripple his cultivation base. Besides, given how tenacious he was, it was always possible Shu Qing might accidentally kill him, and thus kill himself. That wasn't even to mention that the fellow had formidable battle prowess, ensuring that it would take a lot of effort to completely defeat him. After weighing the options, Shu Qing quashed his killing intent, glared coldly at the young man, then put his dagger away and got back onto his Dharma skiff. Seeing that, the first peak disciple finally started to recover from the terror which had been building up in him. As for Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior in the iron skewer, he looked at the distant peak lords and sighed deeply. Why didn't I think of that? It's a freaking good idea. Meanwhile, Shu Qing sat cross-legged on his Dharma skiff, using his shadow to overload himself with mutagen, hoping that it might get rid of the lifelink talisman mark. Actually, the lifelink talisman mark did flicker a bit, but Shu Qing could tell that the process was going very slowly, ignoring the first peak disciple. Shu Qing kept up the process of chipping away at the mark, then took out his bamboo slip and used the iron skewer to carve something on it. Upon seeing the bamboo slip and all the names on it, Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior's eyes went wide. That was especially true considering his name was at the top of the list. That got his heart pounding, and he was suddenly struck with how vengeful of a person Shu Qing was. But what caused him to tremble even more was the realization that, though his own name was crossed out, it looked different from other names that had been crossed out. The other names were crossed out with 3 lines, but his was only crossed out with 1, and it was very faint. Don't tell me he's still thinking about killing me. Terror gripped the Patriarch, and he suddenly decided that he had to work much harder at being useful. The Patriarch then watched as Shu Qing wrote a new name on the list. Idiot. Peering surreptitiously at the first peak disciple, the Patriarch mused that he fully approved of putting this name on the list. As for the first peak disciple, he was breathing a sigh of relief and thinking that if he hadn't run into his master, he would probably have lost his life already. Then he started thinking about the implications of Master Seventh's words, and that caused him to look over at Shu Qing. Unfortunately, he didn't actually know a lot of poetry. Most of the things he said were just random words thrown together. Though he wanted to ask Shu Qing some questions, he wasn't really sure of how to word them. After thinking for a moment, he forced out the following lines. On a sleepless night, I listened to the rain. Is the immortal in the sky your father? Completely ignoring the psychotic ramblings. Shu Qing finished writing idiot, and then put the bamboo slip away. After that, he activated his Dharma skiff's defenses and prepared to put some distance between himself and this young man. Just as he was about to perform an incantation gesture, a rumbling could be heard off in the distance. Looking over toward where the 7 Blood Eyes cultivators were fighting the sea zombies, he saw the mangled torso of a sea zombie gold core cultivator splash into the water, sending out a huge wave before sinking down. Shu Qing's pupils constricted.